Hello, anatomy and physiology students. This is Mrs. V. This is the first part of the first section of the digestive system. And oh, I did not get my little pointer out. So hope y'all are doing all right today. Hope you're someplace comfortable. So the digestive system, I'm breaking up into, we would have done this 2 days in class. And so I've broken it up into two parts. So this first part, so day one, we are going to go through the whole alimentary canal. It's also called the gastrointestinal tract. And so we're just going to go through the whole food tube and basically talk about the structure and the function of all of it. So we're going to go in and out. So the theme is from food to feces. And then we're going to take this little detour. We kind of need to understand the serous membranes that are basically anchoring these organs. And then the second part would be day two. So it's part B. We'll talk about the accessory organs, the pancreas, the liver, the gallbladder, that basically are going to secrete things into our food tube. And then we're going to talk about the particular enzymes involved in chemical digestion and the control of hunger. More so is going to be under nutrition, but we're also definitely going to talk about the control of digestion. So that is where we are headed. Okay, so for this, just to kind of help you in your studies, there's some money slides, meaning there's a lot of content on that slide that you need to know. So I'm going to tell you, you do need to know your shuns. This is the text for you, but I'm going to do it with a picture because it's a lot more fun to look at and to talk about. All right, so shuns, meaning word ending in T-I-O-N-S. So we're talking about food, and so you ingest food. That word just means placing food inside your oral cavity, aka to eat. What's going to happen in the oral cavity is we are going to chew our food, and so chewing is part of that mechanical breakdown of food. So we have to take food from its solid state. We're going to make this moistened lump of food called a bolus in the oral cavity, and then when it gets to the stomach is going to churn and turn it to liquid. And then we're going to go to the small intestine, and the small intestine is going to move things back and forth, so that's going to be segmentation. So the chewing, the churning of the stomach, and segmentation are all going to help that sort of physical or mechanical breakdown of our food. And then the other shun is going to be propulsion. So once we go through swallowing, which is called deglutition, that there's going to be these wave-like contractions called peristalsis that are going to move food down the esophagus. So peristalsis is just a term that's just an example of just how we move food through the food tube. And so peristalsis is going to occur, the stomach's going to let stuff out, the small intestine, and then the large intestine. That's just how we're going to move our food through the tube, through propulsion. What's happening as our food goes through this food tube is the chemical digestion. And so we need to take food from really large molecules to their simple monomer units, so then we can absorb our food into the bloodstream. So across the mucosa of the gastrointestinal tract, into the bloodstream, we absorb our fats in the lymphatic system, but that's what we mean when we say absorption. We are not capable of chemically digesting everything, so there's going to be some waste products that we're going to eliminate as feces, and it's not called number two, the shun, it's going to be defecation. And so those are just some definitions for you that you need to know. Okay, so this is just a nice pictorial representation of what we're talking about in Unit 4. And so like I said, we are going to talk through the digestive system, and basically it is a big, long food tube. And so we're going to take our food, which are normally macromolecules, so carbohydrates, fats, proteins in our food. We're going to mechanically and chemically digest them, and this occurs inside that open space, inside the lumen of the tube. And the goal of that chemical digestion is to break things down into simple molecules, so glucose, fatty acids, amino acids. From there, this is going to be covered under nutrition and metabolism, the body has two choices. It can break those foods down further, so breaking things apart, catabolism, in order to produce our energy, so ATP, or it can use those simple monomer units sort of like Legos, because we are made up of the same biological building blocks as the things we eat, and then build body structures, and so that's called anabolism. And so catabolism, you get ATP because you're breaking things down, and to build, it takes energy, it takes ATP. Okay, all right, not working. There we go. All right, so the organs of the digestive system. So we're going to go through the alimentary canal, and like I said, it's about 8 meters long. That's about 25 feet long. That really is a disassembly line. So the tube part itself is going to be the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestines, the large intestine, the rectum, and then feces exits out the anus. There are some accessory glands accessory organs that are going to help in this digestion. So teeth, salivary glands, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. And the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, they're going to be secreting things into that food tube to aid digestion. All right, so this is one of my favorite YouTubes. Sit back, relax. There's a couple funny things about it. See if you can notice what I find humorous. Here we go.
And with her new teeth, she can take on more solid foods. Digestion starts in the mouth. Teeth grind up the food. Then, special glands under the tongue pump out saliva to help break down and lubricate the food on its 12-hour, 13-foot journey through the gut. It'll pass from the stomach into the coils of the small intestine before finally passing into the large intestine. Waves of contracting muscle keep the food moving, a process called peristalsis. These contractions are so powerful, we can even eat upside down. For the first time, a new camera shows a high-definition view of how food travels through our bodies and into our stomachs.
That's the stomach.
Food enters the stomach through a hole at the top. The stomach is a bag of muscle that churns, squashes, and squeezes food into liquid. At the same time, acids break the food down. The stomach walls protect themselves with a lining of mucus. Without it, the acids could digest parts of the stomach itself, causing stomach ulcers. About an hour later, the stomach squeezes the broken down food out through a tiny hole called the pyloric sphincter. The food enters the small intestine, an 11-foot coil of tube where we absorb most of the nutrients. The interior wall of the small intestine is lined with millions of microscopic projections called villi. These increase the surface area of the gut, making it easier to absorb nutrients. First, the pancreas pumps out a juice that neutralizes stomach acid. Then bile from the liver breaks down the fats into tiny droplets. Smaller droplets are easier for the intestine to absorb. After an hour and a half, the small intestine has absorbed most of the nutrients from the food. It's time for what remains to move on. It enters the large intestine through this, the ileocecal sphincter, a valve that keeps our food from going back where it came from. What's left is a mix of waste food and dead cells from the walls of the gut. The large intestine's main job is to extract water from it. Lots of bacteria live here too, but it isn't because of an infection. We actually need them. They produce enzymes that break down complex carbohydrates in our food, carbohydrates we couldn't otherwise digest. Finally, after about 12 hours, we expel what's left of our first meal.
Okay, well I hope you enjoyed that. Alright, there's two things about that video I find hysterically funny. One, adorable little girl, so cute. But don't you think they could have cleaned her nostrils just a little bit? She's got those little dry caked on boogers. And then there's that other point in the video where the music gets really, really ominous sounding, and they just kind of show her eyes really big, and she kind of grabs that little bunny of hers like, oh, what are they doing to that child? I hope you enjoyed that. Yeah, some great camera work. I suggest that after we finish and we can make it through the food tube that you go ahead and watch that, because you can see a lot of those anatomical features that we're about to talk about. Oops, don't want to watch again. Okay, so we are going to go through this structure function as we go through this food tube. And like I said, it's roughly about 25 feet long. Takes about 1.5 feet to go from your oral cavity to your stomach. And then there's 20 feet of small intestine. It's smaller in diameter, which is why it's called the small intestine. Your large intestine are about 5 feet long. We're going to kind of work through this. You also have an assignment to do. You're going to do a color structure function sheet with me. Okay, so this whole food tube basically has the same construction of the wall. And so there's 4 layers, and so everywhere is going to have a mucosa, which is that innermost layer. Beneath that is going to be the submucosa, and then going more superficial, then we're going to have a muscularis layer, and then the outermost layer is the serosa. And so you definitely need to know the 4 layers. There are places in the gastrointestinal tract where the layers are somewhat different, or there's an exception, and I kind of want you to key in on those. I'll be sure to bring them to your attention, because at the end of this, I need to test you on it. I can't just say, hey, it's a tube. So there always has to be something that's special about each particular region as we talk about it. So this inner lining, of course, it's going to be endothelium. It is always going to be mucosa, so epithelial. There's going to be an epithelial layer. In the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, and then the anal canal, these are all going to be subject to abrasion. So it's going to be stratified squamous. But for the rest of the food tube, it's going to be pretty much just simple columnar epithelium. Right underneath that, because all epithelial structure is going to be connected to a basement membrane, and then you have the connective tissue underneath, is the lamina propria. So that's going to be that connective tissue, the wall between 2 cities that kind of glues that epithelial mucosa lining to it. That is where you find malt. Remember in our unit on the immune system, we talked about mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. This is going to be for immune protection. The food that we eat is not sterile, so that's a great place for immune surveillance. The mucosa has a thin layer of muscle associated with it, and so that's called the muscularis mucosa. There are some places throughout this food tube that have some structures, structural folds. There's folds in the stomach called rugae. In the small intestine, we're going to look at circular folds and villi, but that's where those folds come from. It's going to be those smaller folds are going to be coming from this muscularis mucosa, so that thin layer right there. So innermost layer mucosa, and then deep to that right here, we have the submucosa. So that word sub means below mucosa. And so you can see it's a pretty colorful layer right here. So we have a lot going on there. This is going to be loose connective tissue. We have nerves, arteries, veins, lymphatic tissue running through there. So that's going to feed our mucosa. Just remember, epithelial tissue is avascular. Also, what we're going to have under there, we have some submucosal glands, which can also secrete things into the mucosa, through the mucosa into our lumen. And that's mostly going to be mucus and things for secretion, just to help protect that lining, help move through along. But the job, of course, of that connective tissue is going to nourish the surrounding tissues and allow for that transport of our absorbed food. So that's going to be the absorptive layer. Okay, so mucosa, submucosa. Now we have the muscularis layer. And so this is going to be smooth muscle. It is involuntary. We have an outer longitudinal layer. And we have an inner circular layer. So this is the layer that's responsible for peristalsis, moving food through the food tube. There is one region of the tube, the stomach, that is going to have an extra layer, so it makes it special. And so there's going to be a deep oblique, which means diagonal layer in the stomach. Since this has to be controlled, it's going to be autonomic control, there is a myenteric nerve plexus. So in this picture, all the yellow, this is showing you a nervous plexus. So it just means a network of neurons that are going to control motility right here. There's also one that's going to the mucosa as well. I'll show you on the other slide. Then the outermost layer for these organs, majority of them are going to have a serosa. And so this is just that visceral peritoneum that's going to be have connective tissue underneath. It's going to secrete serous fluid, and so we're going to get that lubrication for moving parts. If you don't feel your small intestines, you don't feel that peristalsis, you don't feel any segmentation. Something that's special about the esophagus does not have a serosa. It has an outer adventitia. So that makes the esophagus special. Not all organs are going to have a cirrhosis. Some of them are retroperitoneal, so part of the small intestine, the duodenum, the pancreas, and portions of the large intestine are going to be behind the peritoneum. There you go. Okay, so movements of this food tube. So we have this muscularis layer. So there's 4 different types of movement. That one we already talked about is peristalsis, and so that's just going to be adjacent segments of the alimentary canal. They're going to just alternate contraction and relaxing, just sort of propulsion, move food through the food tube. The small intestine have some special movements that only occur there. One of them is called segmentation. The final stages of digestion and all of our nutrient absorption occur in the small intestine. And so what segmentation does is food is moved backwards and forwards, and the idea is that this food is going to be mixed together, and that all of it is going to be exposed to the wall of the gastrointestinal tract. And so it's just a special kind of movement. You only find it in the small intestine. It helps, some more mechanical breakdown, but the idea is that all the food stuff will be exposed to that mucosa so you can get absorption through that mucosa. That mucosa is a secretory, so it secretes things and it absorbs things. Another type of movement that only occurs in the small intestine is called the migrating motility complex. And so this migrating motility complex, its job, basically when we are fasting, there is a hormone release, motilin, and it's released it causes this peristalsis, this repulsion about every 1.5 to 2 hours. And the idea is that when we are fasting, we don't want food stuff to remain in the small intestine. And so it's basically to, get that crap out of there, and just to make sure that food doesn't remain stagnant in the small intestine, and then we get an opening of the ileocecal valve, and then food will move into the large intestine. The large intestine has its own special movement. It's called a mass movement. And so this is a long, slow, peristaltic wave of contraction when you eat something. So this word gastro, whenever you see gastric always means stomach, and colic refers to the colon, which is the large intestine. And so when we eat, there is a gastrocolic reflex, which causes this mass movement. And this mass movement is going to move our non-digestible waste into this space called the rectum. And when the rectum becomes sufficiently full, that's when you get the call or the urge to defecate. And so that's why usually our bathroom habits are oriented around our mealtime. Okay, so this is just kind of for understanding, because we're going to continue going through our food tube, and as we talk about it, it's pretty complex if you think about it. The goal of the digestive system is to digest our food and make sure we absorb everything. Your body does not want to waste energy. And think about it, we eat different things at different times. Sometimes it's all liquid, sometimes it's high in carbohydrates, sometimes it's, a fatty meal. It takes a lot to coordinate that. So there's three basic levels of control mechanisms. So some of them are long reflexes, meaning it involves the central nervous system and the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is what drives our hunger. It also signals the autonomic nervous system to control digestion. Whether you knew it or not, you actually have more neurons in the enteric nervous system. Enteric always means intestine, so it's always referring to the intestine. But those nerve plexes, so the submucosal plexus and the myenteric plexus, there are more neurons there than are in your spinal cord. And so these are going to be short reflexes. The easiest, the simplest way to describe it is when there is food in any of those organs, that smooth muscle wall is stretched, and that's going to trigger those reflexes. And so there's going to be increased secretions and increased motility of that organ. This kind of makes sense. If there's food there, we're going to need secretions, and then we also need that food to move through motility. The last thing we're going to talk about so it will be day 2, is going to be the hormones. The stomach and the small intestines secrete hormones to guide digestion. Okay, so like I said, here's the money slide again. So just really, really simply, this control of digestion. So remember learning about the autonomic nervous system. We had the parasympathetic, which was rest and digest. So yeah, think of this. So parasympathetic is going to stimulate digestion. And for digestion, we're going to get increased secretion, increased motility through the food tube. In order for it to move between the different organs, we need a relaxation of sphincters. And then 2, we want to absorb all those nutrients, so we're going to increase blood flow to the viscera. What inhibits digestion is over here, the sympathetic nervous system, through the release of norepinephrine. We're going to get decreased secretions into the tube, decreased motility, and then the sphincters are going to constrict and basically keep the food wherever it is in the digestive tract, and of course decrease blood flow. If we are running from a bear or fighting from a bear, that blood is going to go to the skeletal muscles, the heart, the lungs, the brain. We really don't care if breakfast doesn't get digested if we're not going to live in the next 10 minutes. And so hopefully that's not, news to you about those two systems. Hopefully you remember that. Okay, so we're going to start with the mouth. So the mouth, your pie hole, your oral cavity, ingests food, and what's going to happen in the mouth is we're going to mix our food with salivary secretions, and we're going to get that softened lump of food. A bolus is going to form. Chewing is that mechanical breakdown, and we're going to mix it with saliva. That is called mastication. And we are, like I said, that mixing of food, that liquid, mixing it with liquid and just kind of softening it up, it prepares that food for digestion, and that occurs in the oral cavity. And the oral cavity is basically anything inside of your teeth, between your lips and your gums. That's the vestibule. So this right here is the oral cavity. You've all eaten, so it's kind of nice. The tongue plays a big part in this. The tongue helps move food back and forth. Also, our taste buds are there, so it makes food enjoyable. But it's going to mix the food, and then when it's time to swallow, it's going to move that food back towards our pharynx. So your tongue has a root, it has a body, and is attached to the floor of the oral cavity by a lingual frenulum. And sometimes this is extended too far forward, and that's when someone is tongue-tied and has difficulty speaking, and so we'll just go ahead and cut that. So we've got the tongue is going to basically make the floor of the oral cavity, and then the roof is going to be the hard palate and the soft palate. And both of them have roles in swallowing. When it's time to swallow food, we're going to just push that bolus up against the hard palate and roll our tongue backwards. This soft palate is going to swing up, and it's going to block food going up into our nasopharynx and our nasal cavity. Teeth are involved in that mechanical breakdown. You have 20 baby teeth, and then you're going to get 3 more sets of molars after that, and that makes your adult teeth, your baby teeth, fall out, so they're called deciduous teeth. But the role of teeth is that mechanical breakdown of food and mixing it. We get mixing in the mouth with saliva. There we go. Sorry about that. As far as homeostatic imbalances go, there are bacteria, of course, living in your mouth. Streptococcus mutans is a type of bacteria. It forms a biofilm, which is that plaque. They live off of the sugars that you eat, and they produce acid, and the acid then erodes away the enamel. And so cavities are called dental caries. And so you kind of, good oral hygiene, brushing, flossing, dental exams, cleaning. Fluoride helps to chelate or basically bind the calcium to keep the integrity of the enamel. They also make great sealants, so children do not get cavities because they're not very good at oral hygiene at that point. As far as health goes, usually looking at someone's dental health, usually if someone has poor dental care, they're probably not taking care of the rest of them. So sometimes that's a tip that your patient is not really caring for themselves. All right, so we've ingested food in our oral cavity, mastication, we've chewed it up. We are going to mix it with saliva. So what is in saliva is mostly water, mucus, enzymes, and antimicrobial proteins. It is slightly acidic. Normally it's about 6.35 to 6.85. If we eat acidic foods, that pH will go up. The functions of saliva is to protect the oral cavity. So in the saliva, we have antibacterial lysozyme, which is going to break bacterial cell walls, and also secretory IgA, so antibodies are in our saliva. Like I said, the idea is it's going to lubricate our food, allows us to taste it, and it helps us prepare for swallowing, so we get that bolus form again. And we are going to begin our chemical digestion. So there are enzymes in saliva. The primary one is salivary amylase. There's a small amount of salivary lipase, but food does not spend a lot of time in your oral cavity, so salivary lipase really doesn't play a big role in digesting your fats. Your salivary glands are under parasympathetic control, so parasympathetic is going to stimulate salivation. So like when you smell bread baking or cookies baking, whenever there's food in your mouth or any sort of stimulus in your mouth, you can even think of food, you're going to get salivation. If you are nervous, so sympathetic nervous system, that's when you get dry mouth, so that's going to inhibit salivation. There are three different sets of glands. You have the parotid salivary glands. Those are the largest. They are next to the ear, so that's where that name comes from. Para means alongside, otic means ear. So these are the largest of the salivary glands, and they are, if you look at the histologically, this slide, you can see that they're mostly serous cells. So the type of saliva that they're secreting is really high in salivary amylase. Pop over here to the smallest of the salivary glands. So sub means below, lingual means tongue. These, you can see it visually looks different. This secretions from these glands are going to be more mucousy than have enzymes in them. So it's sort of a thicker kind of mucus. And then the other set of salivary glands are submandibular salivary glands. Remember, your mandible is your jawbone, so just on the medial side of the jawbone. And so they just kind of make a mixture of the mucus and the amylase. So we're beginning our starch breakdown. Just a reminder that starch is plant storage. So pasta, rice, grains, breads are going to be high in starch. Vegetables are often high in starch, so potatoes. So it's a very large molecule, and so amylase is going to start breaking off those glucose units for us. So when your pancreas also makes amylase, and so, like I said, amylase begins the breakdown of starch, and it breaks off glucose units in two. That sugar is called maltose. And then there are brush border enzymes on the border of the small intestine that will then break it down into glucose, and so that enzyme is called maltase. So just a reminder that ASE endings are always enzymes, and so all food is going to be absorbed in the small intestine. Okay, so yeah, protection from spit. There are people that either due to nerve damage or certain infections or cancers, they lose the ability to salivate, and they actually, anything that inhibits salivary secretions is going to promote tooth decay. So they'll actually lose their teeth within 3 months. It's also really hard to talk when you don't have a lot of saliva, and you certainly can't eat. Halitosis, that's the term for bad breath. So think about it, as you sleep, you have less salivary secretions, and so the bacteria are basically just going to eat and feed off of the decomposing food particles, and they are going to just create the gases that make that halitosis. So that's why there's that lovely morning breath. And so saliva is part of that first line of defense. Okay, so the pharynx, so that is the throat. So it is posterior to the oral cavity. And remember, we have the oral cavity, and we have the oropharynx and laryngopharynx. And so there are muscles that are going to be involved in swallowing, which is called deglutition. And so we're going to go from the pharynx to the esophagus. And it's going to be these constrictor muscles of the pharynx. They're going to help for peristalsis, so move that bolus, that moistened lump of food, into the esophagus. But your esophagus is normally a closed space. It is behind your trachea, so behind your windpipe, and so it is normally closed, whereas the trachea is held open. That's an open patent space. And so this inferior constrictor muscles, they are going to make up the upper esophageal sphincter. So only when there is a bolus of food is it going to relax and open. And so this just prevents a lot of air from entering the stomach. Just kind of remind you the parts of the pharynx. Okay, so deglutition, and then we will hit pause on this one. So hang with me. All right, so swallowing is called deglutition. There's a voluntary phase. There's a swallowing reflex, so involuntary phase, and then peristalsis is going to transport that food from the pharynx to the stomach. So that's where the esophagus is. So let's take a look.
Swallowing, or deglutition, is the process by which food passes from the mouth, through the pharynx and into the esophagus. As simple as it might seem to healthy people, swallowing is actually a very complex action that requires an extremely precise coordination with breathing, since both of these processes share the same entrance, the pharynx. Failure to coordinate would result in choking or pulmonary aspiration. Swallowing involves over 20 muscles of the mouth, throat, and esophagus, which are controlled by several cortical areas and by the swallowing centers in the brainstem. The brain communicates with the muscles through several cranial nerves. Swallowing consists of 3 phases. Oral or buccal phase. This is the voluntary part of swallowing. The food is moistened with saliva and chewed, food bolus is formed, and the tongue pushes it to the back of the throat, the pharynx. This process is under neural control of several areas of cerebral cortex, including the motor cortex. Pharyngeal phase starts with stimulation of tactile receptors in the oropharynx by the food bolus. The swallow reflex is initiated and is under involuntary neuromuscular control. The following actions are taken to ensure the passage of food or drink into the esophagus. The tongue blocks the oral cavity to prevent going back to the mouth. The soft palate blocks entry to the nasal cavity. The vocal folds close to protect the airway to the lungs. The larynx is pulled up with the epiglottis flipping over, covering the entry to the trachea. This is the most important step, since entry of food or drink into the lungs may potentially be life-threatening. The upper esophageal sphincter opens to allow passages to the esophagus. Esophageal phase. Food bolus is propelled down the esophagus by peristalsis, a wave of muscular contraction that pushes the bolus ahead of it. The larynx moves down back to the original position.
Okay, so the nice thing is you've all swallowed. You've all experienced that. Dysphagia often occurs in patients if they've had strokes or if they have been unconscious for a long time. Anytime that someone hasn't swallowed, particularly in the elderly, dysphagia is a difficulty in swallowing. So you are going to run into that as a healthcare professional. This is just some verbiage for you. It's basically everything we just watched. We have the voluntary phase once it hits the oropharynx, and then it is that involuntary phase. And then we'll have peristalsis down the esophagus. Like I said, that's kind of for you. Just a reminder that epiglottis is that larynx rises and the food bolus is forced backwards. That epiglottis is going to tip backwards and block the openings to the airways. And then, like I said, so sphincters. So know your sphincters. So at the top of the esophagus is the upper esophageal sphincter. As the esophagus goes through the mediastinum, that top third is going to be skeletal muscle. That middle portion is when we're making that transition between skeletal and smooth muscle, so about half and half. And then the lower part of the esophagus, the bottom 1/3, is just going to be all smooth muscle. Right there at that junction between the esophagus and the stomach is that lower esophageal sphincter. So you do need to know your sphincters. Like I said, the esophagus, it goes through the mediastinum, and so it's going to run through that thoracic cavity, and it's going to exit from the thoracic cavity into the abdominal cavity through the esophageal hiatus. And so we've got the diaphragm is going to contract and then relax upon breathing. This sphincter right here, that lower esophageal sphincter, its other name is gastroesophageal sphincter, it's going to relax to receive that bolus of food. This sphincter, as far as sphincters are concerned, is kind of a wimpy sphincter. It is not very powerful. And so it fails often. So if you've ever had heartburn or reflux, it was due to a failure of this lower esophageal sphincter. And so the acidic contents from the stomach came up into the esophagus. The esophagus is not designed for that acidity, and so that's why you feel that pain, that burn with heartburn. And so that's just kind of showing you, we have the mucosa. It's going to be the secretory and absorptive layer, that submucosa, that connective tissue, and it has those submucosal glands secreting lubrication into the esophagus. We have that muscularis layer, the outer longitudinal inner circular, that is going to make those wave-like peristaltic contractions. And then that outer adventitia, and that adventitia is only in the esophagus, so that makes it special. And so, yes, this is a money slide. It's nice. It just kind of breaks down some of the functions and some definitions and just where all the sphincters are. So, yeah, that's a money slide, and just kind of tell you that failure of that lower esophageal sphincter is the cause of heartburn and gastroesophageal reflux disorder. So this is a good one to study. There is a Quizlet for this, and these are all on there, but I'm just saying these are good money slides for you. All right, so I'm going to wrap this one up, and we will begin with the stomach, part 2 of day 1. Have a great day.